When the system lets people down, some don't just snap. They go full-on revenge mode. A female assassin in Mexico became a one-woman execution squad. An ultra-violent bully in rural America finally met his match. And then there's the guy who took civil disobedience to the next level by declaring war on his own town. Sometimes all that's left in the tank is vengeance. And we've got some blood-spattered tales of retribution on today's episode of the Infographics Show. Number 11. How long could you hold a grudge? A month? A year? A few years? How about 5 decades? In 2012, headlines broke about a 73-year-old man from South Dakota named Carl Erickson who had just pleaded guilty to murder, an act of revenge 50 years in the making. His victim, Norm Johnson, a former high school classmate, was shot dead at his front door. His body was found later by his wife in a pool of blood. Erickson, a known heavy drinker who struggled with depression, had finally acted on a grudge dating back to the 1950s. As a teenage sports manager, he'd been mocked and humiliated in the gym locker room by Johnson. While Johnson moved on playing college football and coaching football at their old high school for almost 30 years, Erickson had clearly never forgotten. The pain festered until it exploded on Johnson's front step. Erickson didn't say much about the murder, but admitted something had stayed in his subconscious all that time. It seemed the incident in question involved Johnson putting a jockstrap on Erickson's head. Sure, jocks can sometimes be annoying, but to wait all that time and then murder a man in his 70s was extreme overkill. Erickson did at least acknowledge that he might have overreacted. He said, "I just wish I could turn the calendar back." However, it seems turning the calendar back was where all the problems had started. Now let's take a look at maybe the meanest spurned lover in history. Number 10. In 1938, darkness fell on a remote hamlet in Okayama Prefecture, Japan. Earlier in the evening, the power had suddenly cut out, plunging the village into total darkness. High in the hills, 21-year-old Mutsuo Toi, a quiet young man with a festering grudge, strapped 2 flashlights to his head. He was ready. Toi began with the person closest to him, his ailing grandmother, the woman who raised him after tuberculosis claimed both his parents. She had spent her life trying to protect him, keeping him from the fields and encouraging him to study. But as she slept peacefully in her bed, Toi stepped into her room. The steel of his sharpened axe flashed under his headlamps. One savage strike to her neck, and then another and another. A sight a newspaper will later call a gruesome picture of hell. Toi calmly prepared for war. He strapped a samurai-style sword to his hip, slipped daggers into his belt, slung a modified Browning shotgun across his shoulder, and packed a bag with 200 rounds of ammunition. At 4 p.m. that same day, Toi had written a farewell note to his sister, telling her to live well. By dusk, he had ridden his bicycle to the village's power lines, climbed a pole, and cut the wires. About 7 hours later, he went house to house, door to door, hunting his neighbors in their sleep. As shotgun blasts woke up the village, he kept on moving. A one-man army intent on total destruction. "I have no grudge against you," he reportedly told one woman before pulling the trigger. He massacred entire families in 11 houses, killing 27 people outright, with 2 more dying later from their wounds. 3 survived with serious injuries. He shot men, women, and children, and then hacked others to death with his sword. Some victims died clutching the doors that they'd held shut. Others died in their beds embracing their partners. By sunrise, the carnage was over. Following a trail of blood, police found Toi's dead body on a nearby mountain. He had gone out the samurai way, but not with any honor. The question is, why? The next day, the Tokyo Asahi Shimbun gave the reason when it ran the headline, "32 killed, farm boy driven mad by failed love and illness." Toi had suffered from pleurisy, a complication of tuberculosis, for 9 long years. The illness had barred him from military service and seriously messed up his life. But he wasn't poor. His mom and dad had left the family plenty of land, so young Toi was better off than most of the villagers. And in his teenage years, he had been popular with women. Some reports say he was a creepy sex addict. But after he got sick, females started to reject his advances. One woman he had once loved, who had rejected him years earlier, had returned to the village after a failed marriage. But to Toi, it was a humiliation. She had to die, but because Toi believed the whole village had forsaken him, they all had to die. He left behind 2 final notes. In one, he wrote, "I am by no means mentally ill. I have been battling an incurable disease for 9 years, and I am taking revenge on the villagers who treated me poorly and mistreated me during that time." He had held that grudge a long time. He claimed to have planned his attack for 3 years. It was during those years that he had changed. He started to scare the villagers, but they never thought that he would resort to murder. To this day, Mutsuo Toi remains the deadliest spree killer in Japanese history. This next man, he was a true revenge hero in a story that might sound familiar. Number 9. This story begins in France in the year 1807. François-Pierre Picot, a humble shoemaker in the city of Nîmes, was engaged to Marguerite Vigoureux. This was an unusual pairing, and not just because Pierre didn't quite match his lover's attractiveness, but because she was filthy rich. In those days, humble men didn't usually marry into the higher classes. For Pierre's friends, their buddy was punching way above his weight, but rather than congratulate him, they seethed with envy. 3 of them, Lupin, Solari, and Chaubard, concocted a story, telling the police that Pierre was a spy for the much-hated English. A 4th man, Alut, knew all about this plot but chose to stay quiet as Pierre was thrown into a cold, dark cell at the dreaded Fenestrelle Fortress prison. Worse, the day that Pierre had been arrested, he and Marguerite were supposed to get married. As he sat in that dank dungeon, he didn't even know what he'd been arrested for. It wasn't until his 2nd year that he discovered the outrageous charges against him. But who, he wondered, would set him up? Pierre, now languishing from loneliness and solitary confinement, dug a tunnel that took him to the next cell. The occupant of that cell was an Italian priest named Father Torri. One day he told Pierre that he had once buried treasure in the Italian city of Milan, enough treasure to make a man rich for life. So when Torri died the next year, Pierre made plans to get out of prison, to find the treasure, and to use his riches to seek revenge on those who had wronged him. In 1814, he got his chance, when after the fall of Napoleon's imperial government, he was released. Old Torri hadn't been lying. The treasure was where he said it was. Pierre returned to Paris, where he changed his name and lived the life of a rich man, unbeknownst to Marguerite, who is now married to one of the co-conspirators, Lupin. How Pierre found out about the plot isn't clear, but it seems that he might have tracked Alut down, and Alut told Pierre the details. The first victim, Chaubard, was stabbed to death by Pierre's dagger. He set Lupin's son up for a crime. The subsequent imprisonment destroyed Marguerite, who reportedly died from shock. But Pierre wasn't done. He saw that Lupin had bought a stylish café on the Boulevard des Italiens, much in part thanks to a generous dowry that had been provided by Marguerite's family. Pierre burned it down, leaving Lupin bankrupt. With everything Lupin loved now gone, Pierre met him one day and explained the curse Lupin had suddenly believed that he'd been struck by. As this old friend wept, Pierre stuck a dagger in his heart. He would later poison Solari. Pierre went back to Alut. The two got into a fight, leaving Pierre seriously injured. French police discovered the dying Pierre, at which point he made a full confession. Meanwhile, Alut fled to the poverty-stricken streets of London's East End, where on his deathbed in 1828 he dictated the full story of Pierre's revenge. It was while reading about the story in the memoirs from the archives of the Paris police that the writer Alexandre Dumas found it and turned it into a novel, The Count of Monte Cristo, in which he acknowledges Pierre Picot. For sure, there might have been some creative license liberally applied to Pierre's story, but it remained in the archives of revenge history. Let's now take a look at a very real Mexican vigilante. Number 8. About 90% of the murders in Mexico don't get solved. That includes murders against women, of which Mexico has one of the highest rates in the world. From about 100 total murders a day, 10 are women and girls, and 3 women a day are murdered solely because they are women, known as femicide. One of the worst places for this is Ciudad Juarez. All of the gruesome violence against women has led to mass activism, but sometimes it takes one person to send a message. In 2013, a woman with blonde hair or wearing a blonde wig boarded a bus on the busy streets of Ciudad Juarez. As the bus wound its way past strip malls and houses, the woman calmly walked up to the driver and shot him in the back of the head. She did the same thing to another bus driver a few days later. A woman calling herself Diana, Huntress of Bus Drivers, wrote on local news websites and social media that this was revenge for the numerous sexual attacks on buses against women. Before Diana unloaded the gun in one of the murders, she said, "You guys think you're real bad, don't you?" Local media later received an email from Diana, the bus driver hunter, stating that she was an instrument of vengeance for several women. Diana believes that she was fighting for justice for the estimated 800 girls and women who've been attacked or abducted by Ciudad Juarez bus drivers. She wrote, "You think because we are women we are weak." She was settling the score, so she said. So it seems it didn't matter at all for Diana if the victims were guilty of a crime. Even so, she gained a lot of support in the local community, with one woman saying to the media, "With the police doing nothing in a society that doesn't care, it is understandable that she took justice into her own hands." But as you'll now see, some female killers really take things too far. Number 7. Born in 1760 in Nuremberg, Germany, Anna Schönleben spent much of her childhood living with various families as an orphan. She was fortunate to get a sponsor who ensured that she was educated, and then at just 15 she was married off to a lawyer, Mr. Zwanziger, who was 15 years her senior. They had 2 kids together, but he was an incorrigible drunk, and with no money to feed the kids, Anna took up the world's oldest profession, prostitution. Her clients of choice were wealthy men, local politicians, and judges. She was good at what she did, good enough to eventually open up her own store. With her husband now dead, she poured everything into that shop, but it failed. Then came a stroke of luck. In 1808, a local justice named Wolfgang Glosser had just been left by his wife. Anna took a job as his housekeeper. Glosser was rich, old, and lonely. It seemed like a perfect match until his wife came back. Anna still stayed in the house. A few months later, Mrs. Glosser was struck by crippling stomach pains. On August 26, 1808, she died after days of vomiting and diarrhea. No one raised any suspicion. Anna moved on. Her next employer was another wealthy judge, Mr. Grollmann, just 38 years old but in poor health. At first he seemed to improve, and then, like Mrs. Glosser, he developed a case of severe stomach pains. 11 days later, he was dead. Doctors blamed natural causes. Next, Anna was hired by the prominent Gebhardt family. Mrs. Gebhardt had just given birth to a healthy baby girl when 3 days later she collapsed in agony. Her last words, gasped through clenched teeth, were, "Merciful heaven, you have given me poison." Still, Anna slipped away uncharged. But on August 25, 1809, her luck finally turned. Justice Gebhardt invited 2 guests to dinner. All 3 were soon vomiting, doubled over in pain. A messenger and a porter who had also drunk from the house fell ill as well. This time no one died, but suspicion loomed over Anna, and Gebhardt fired her. But this time a witness came forward. A maid claimed that she had seen Anna putting salt in the drinks. The salt tested positive for arsenic, but Anna had already vanished. Autopsies were performed on some of the previous victims. Traces of arsenic were found. The hunt was on. Anna was arrested later that year in Bayreuth and charged with 4 murders. It took months before she confessed. On September 17, 1811, moments before the guillotine fell, she said, "It is perhaps better for the community that I should die, as it would be impossible for me to give up the practice of poisoning people." But what was she avenging? They say hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. It seems Anna was simply bitter. She believed her beauty had earned her a better life. She envied women who had what she thought she deserved, so she killed them. Let's now take a look at the revenge story that feels a little more like justice. Number 6. In 1868, the USA had just been ravaged by a civil war. The Union had won, but the fight was by no means over. In the South, gangs of vigilantes roamed the highways and byways seeking retribution. That year, an 8-year-old boy named Frank Eaton was at home in Kansas with his father when 6 masked men from a gang calling themselves the Regulators burst into their house. The father, an abolitionist, was shot down in cold blood as young Frank watched in horror. At the funeral, a family friend took Frank aside and he said, "My boy, may an old man's curse rest upon you if you do not try to avenge your father." Well, the next day, that same man gave him a Navy Colt revolver. Frank took those words to heart. He learned how to shoot, how to draw quickly. He could shoot the head off a rattlesnake from a distance. He could shoot coins he flicked into the air before they hit the ground. After attending Fort Gibson to train with the cavalry, he was given the nickname Pistol Pete. Soon he was bragging that he was even faster on the draw than the legendary Buffalo Bill. But Frank still had a debt to settle. As his fame grew as a deputy marshal working in some of the most dangerous regions of the West, he was able to find 5 of those men, killing each one of them in separate events. He only missed out on one because the guy was already dead, murdered in a card game for dealing from the bottom of the deck. Frank died at the ripe old age of 97, a true legend of the Wild West. This next tale of revenge isn't supposed to be funny, but, well, it is. Number 5. In 1992, a well-liked local welder named Marvin Heemeyer bought a small plot of land on the edge of a very small town in scenic Colorado. Marvin was friendly and helpful, but known for his passion in the heat of debate. Heemeyer later opened a muffler shop, but he soon found himself locked in a battle with town bureaucracy. By 1997, trouble began to boil over. A wealthy local family wanted to build a concrete batch plant, and the problem, well, Heemeyer's plot was in the way. He agreed to sell, but he jacked up the price to nearly $1 million in today's money, well beyond its value. Eventually, he sold up and he pocketed a solid profit, but when the city zoning commission greenlit the plant, he was furious. It would block access to his shop, so he fought back. Lawsuits, complaints, zoning appeals, the city refused to budge. For his supporters, it was a case of the rich winning again. in a country where wealth can buy you justice. For the next 5 years, Heemeyer stewed, working furiously in his very private workshop. Then in 2002, after losing his final appeal, he took a trip to an auction in California. There, for about $28,000 in today's money, he bought a Komatsu D355A bulldozer, a massive machine more suited to leveling mountains than a guy who fits mufflers for a living might need. He then sold his muffler shop and land, banking about $700,000. For over a year, he modified the bulldozer into what looked more like a tank. He welded 1-foot-thick steel armor around the cab. He added 3 rifles, bulletproof cameras, and a makeshift air system. It was a beast, and he called it the MK Tank. On June 4, 2004, Marvin lowered the steel shell over himself and he fired up the engine. The MK Tank roared to life. First stop, the concrete plant. He smashed through it like it was a papier-mâché model built by a child. Workers hurled debris trying to throw stuff into the tracks, but nothing stopped Marvin's machine. It was slow, but unstoppable. Then he moved on. The town hall, the local bank, the newspaper office, cars, houses, all flattened. He plowed through trees, utility poles, streetlights. Nothing could hold him back. A massive industrial scraper that tried to get in his way was tossed aside like a toy. The local police soon arrived and they drew their weapons. They fired hundreds of rounds, but their bullets pinged off harmlessly. Heemeyer fired back through the gun ports. SWAT teams screamed over bullhorns, but inside the sealed cab, Heemeyer couldn't hear them and he wouldn't care if he could. He targeted transformers and a propane storage yard, triggering a mass evacuation. Miraculously, no one was killed, but 11 of the 13 buildings he destroyed were occupied just minutes before. At one point, officials considered calling in an Apache helicopter or even using a Javelin anti-tank missile. But it never came to that. At around 4:30 p.m., after more than 2 hours of destruction, the bulldozer broke down in the wreckage of a hardware store. SWAT teams approached, assault rifles at the ready, and then a single gunshot rang out. Heemeyer's revenge cost the town $7 million. To the media, he was a dangerous man who nearly killed dozens, but to others, he became a folk hero. A blue-collar David taking on Goliath, a martyr crushed by bureaucracy and big money. To this day, people still leave flowers on the site of the carnage. Now let's move on to Europe for a very special case of bloody revenge. Number 4. In the early 20th century, somewhere in present-day Serbia, a young woman dressed in rags sat across from an elderly woman. The old woman was known as a healer. She could make women's issues disappear very fast. The young lady told her about a problem with her husband. Within a week, the husband is gone, dead. Problem solved. The healer Baba Anoika was renowned in this superstitious part of the world as an herbalist who could get things done. Love struck? She'd sell you a love potion. Sick? She could cure any ailment. If you had a problematic husband, her magic water would kill him within a week and it would look like he died of natural causes. There were so many of these problematic husbands that Anoika even had a salesperson working for her. Her potions were almost perfect. So good that her customers believed that she could strike men down with black magic. But what she was really doing was giving the women water spiked with arsenic. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to kill. It's believed her potions could have murdered up to 150 men, but their real number will never be known. But why did she do it? After all, she was born into wealth and she was well educated, living a very privileged existence. She later married a much older man and had 11 kids, so her life seemed to be going well. Well, it seems like another case of bitterness, of fury against those who had wronged her in the past. At around the age of 20, she had fallen in love with an Austrian military officer. He gave her syphilis and dumped her, leaving her with a broken heart and a promise in her mind to get her own back on the bad men of the world. So with so much hate in her heart, she decided to help other women murder their spouses. She was 90 when she was arrested, when a German newspaper called her the Witch of Vladimirovac. In prison, she professed to want to remarry, telling a newspaper reporter, "If I had good dentures in my mouth, I would be more beautiful and could marry again." Because of her old age, she only spent a few years behind bars and later died in the comfort of her home, age 100. Now let's take a look at the story of a woman who took the law into her own hands when life offered her nothing. Number 3. Poolan Devi was born in 1963 into a low-caste family in rural India, an already punishing fate made worse by being a girl. Her family was desperately poor. She was married off to a much older man for 100 rupees, a bicycle, and a cow. What followed was a childhood shaped by violence. Years later, she was abducted by a gang of bandits known as the Dacoits. According to her, she was repeatedly abused by the gang leader, a man from a higher caste. Another gang member reportedly killed the leader, took over, and made Poulin his partner, both romantically and criminally. Together, like the Indian Bonnie and Clyde, they raided villages, especially those belonging to upper castes. They robbed trains, ambushed vehicles, and they were not shy about using extreme violence. To the oppressed, she became a folk hero, India's Robin Hood, a girl who struck back at a brutal caste-ridden society. But everything changed in 1981 with the Bemai massacre. After her partner was killed by rivals, Poulin and her crew returned to Bemai, dragging more than 20 Thakur men from their homes. They executed at least 20 of them in what was claimed to be a revenge killing. Poulin's name was tied to the massacre, though she denied being present during the killings. Regardless, she'd become the most wanted woman in India. By 1983, facing mounting pressure, she surrendered to police, but only after negotiating terms. She spent 11 years in prison, never convicted of a single crime, and was released in 1994. Then, in an unbelievable twist, she entered politics. In 1996, Poulan Devi, once a child bride, an abuse survivor, and an outlaw, was elected to India's parliament as a member of the Samajwadi Party. She was representing the very people she once fought for. But her past was never far behind. On July 25, 2001, as she stepped outside her Delhi residence, she was gunned down in broad daylight by Sher Singh Rana, a man who claimed to be avenging the deaths of the Thakurs in the Bemai massacre. Rana escaped and was later caught and still insists that his act was justice. Today in India, she's either a cult hero, a victim, or a heartless, cold-blooded killer. Take your pick. Okay, next one. This time, for a change, it's a story that will warm your heart. Number 2. In 1955, a Camorra gangster boss named Pasquale Simonetti was shot down in a hail of bullets outside of a market on the sketchy streets of Naples, Italy. It was a big deal. Simonetti was a major player in Italian organized crime, feared in the city as a tall, imposing man who got things done. He was fair but brutal. Once a girl went to him and told him her boyfriend had gotten her pregnant and then left her. Simonetti went to the boyfriend and asked if he'd preferred spending 10,000 lira in flowers on his marriage or his funeral. And by all accounts, he was a fabulous husband. He truly loved his wife, Pupetta, and she loved him back just as much. 500 people turned up at his wedding, mafia bigwigs and local politicians stuffing envelopes full of cash. Everyone loved the Simonettis. But as things go in the mafia world, there is always someone trying to step on your toes. Pasquale was just 29 years old when he was gunned down, the perpetrator being a rival gangster. Pupetti was absolutely devastated. She was heartbroken, and now she was 6 months pregnant, thinking about the father her child would never have. And it was all gone. And as per usual, the corrupt cops refused to even look into it. So she waited, and after a few months, her new child was born, and she went out with her brother in the car looking for the boss who had hired her husband's killer. Calmly opening the door, a Smith & Wesson .38 in her hand, she snarled at him and she opened fire, killing him. It was revenge, pure and simple. Someone had taken everything she loved and she wasn't ashamed of her actions. In court, when she screamed, "I would do it again," the entire room exploded into cheers. A hero to the public and a warning to the underworld, the judge sentenced Pupetta to 18 years, later reduced to 13 years and 4 months. 20 years later, in 1974, the son, now a grown-up man named Pasqualino, was abducted and murdered. To this day, the crime remains a mystery. Okay, last one, an all-time American bully who was visited by karma. Number 1. In 1981, a 47-year-old man was found dead in the driver's seat of his car in Skidmore, Missouri. On the street, dozens of people gathered having witnessed what had just happened. They're good people, many of them God-fearing people, but not one of them would tell the police what they had just seen. The dead man was Ken Rex McElroy. He was a small-town bully of epic proportions, a devil who the New York Times would say terrorized the farm town's 450 citizens. You name it, he had done it. His long, winding rap sheet included charges of arson, burglary, numerous assaults, and this was a farm town, so there were crimes related to hog and cattle rustling. But worse, he'd hurt children, and he'd also been the perpetrator of sexual misconduct. He'd even slayed local pets, 2 beloved dogs of one of his enemies. But nothing stuck. He kept getting away with it, partly a result of witness intimidation. This went on for decades, but eventually the townsfolk had had enough. McElroy had just been convicted of attempted murder in the shooting of a 70-year-old much-loved grocer named Ernest Bo Bowenkamp. McElroy was released on bail pending an appeal, and again, he engaged in threats and harassment. He showed up drunk at the local tavern armed with an M1 Garand rifle, swinging it around with a bayonet attached to the end. After picking up a six-pack and walking out, he got into his truck. He never got back out. His wife Trina, who had been sitting next to him, ran away screaming, covered in his blood. She would later settle out of court for $17,600 in a wrongful death lawsuit, but no one was ever convicted of murder. And as the Times reported, nobody saw a thing. Think those revenge stories were intense? Wait until you see what happens when the wrong people get targeted by drug lords. Check out Times Cartels Messed with the Wrong People to find out what happened, or click on this video instead.